Eddie Van Halen was browsing a pawn shop in Pasadena, looking through used guitars when he spotted something that made his heart stop. Hanging on the wall was a beat-up old Teisco guitar, the exact model he'd played as a teenager, modified in a very specific way. Eddie looked closer and realized this wasn't just similar to his first guitar. This was his first guitar. He asked the owner, "How much for this one?" The owner shook his head firmly. "That one's not for sale. That guitar belonged to Eddie Van Halen when he was a kid. It's going to be worth a fortune someday. I'm keeping it." Eddie stared at the man and said quietly, "I need to tell you something." It was a Saturday afternoon in March 2001, and Eddie Van Halen had some time to kill before meeting his son Wolfgang for lunch. He was driving through Pasadena when he noticed a pawn shop he'd never seen before. Golden State Pawn and Music, with a handwritten sign in the window, guitars, amps, vintage gear. Eddie had a thing for pawn shops and music stores. Even after decades of fame and access to any guitar in the world, he still enjoyed browsing through used equipment. You never knew what you might find. An old amp with a unique sound, a guitar with character, something that sparked inspiration. He parked and walked in wearing his usual incognito outfit, jeans, a plain gray hoodie, sunglasses, and a Dodgers cap. The shop was cluttered but organized. Musical instruments on one wall, jewelry and electronics on another, various odds and ends filling the spaces between. The owner, a man in his 60s named Raymond Chen, looked up from behind the counter. "Help you find something?" "Just browsing," Eddie said. "Mind if I look at the guitars?" "Go ahead, let me know if you want to try anything." Eddie walked to the guitar wall. There were maybe 20 instruments hanging there, mostly cheaper models, a few mid-range guitars, nothing particularly special. Eddie ran his eyes over them, not really looking for anything specific, just enjoying the hunt. Then he saw it. Hanging in the corner, almost hidden behind a newer Fender, was a guitar that made Eddie freeze in place. It was a Teisco Del Rey, a cheap Japanese guitar from the 1960s, the kind of instrument beginning players bought because they couldn't afford a Gibson or a Fender. The guitar was beat up, the finish worn down to bare wood in places, the pickguard cracked. But it was the modifications that caught Eddie's attention. Someone had changed the bridge, adding a crude vibrato system. The pickup selector switch had been moved to an unusual position, and on the back of the headstock, carved into the wood, were 3 letters. EVH. Eddie felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't just a Teisco Del Rey. This was his Teisco Del Rey. His first real electric guitar, bought used when he was 15 years old with money he'd saved from paper route jobs. The guitar he'd learned to play on, the guitar he'd modified himself with hand tools in his parents' garage, trying to make it sound better. Eddie had thought this guitar was gone forever. He'd sold it in 1974, before Van Halen got famous, when he needed money to help buy better equipment for the band. He'd sold it to a music store in Pasadena for $75. And he'd never seen it again. But here it was, nearly 30 years later, hanging in a pawn shop, looking exactly as he remembered it. Eddie's hands were actually shaking as he reached up to take it off the wall. The weight was familiar. The neck felt like coming home. He turned it over and looked at the back of the headstock. There were the letters he'd carved, EVH, Eddie Van Halen. Done with a pocket knife when he was 16, thinking someday those initials might mean something. "That's a cool old guitar, right?" Raymond said, walking over. He'd noticed the customer's interest. Eddie nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. "Yeah, it's really cool. How much?" Raymond's expression changed. "Ah, that one's not for sale. Sorry." Eddie looked up. "Not for sale? It's in a pawn shop." "I know, but that's a special piece. It's got history." "What kind of history?" Raymond smiled like he was about to share a secret. "See those initials on the headstock? EVH? That stands for Eddie Van Halen. The Eddie Van Halen. This was his guitar when he was a kid before he got famous." Eddie stared at the pawn shop owner. "How do you know that?" "The guy who sold it to me told me the story," Raymond said. "Back in '74, Eddie Van Halen sold this guitar to a music store here in Pasadena because he needed money for better equipment. The store owner kept it in his personal collection. When he retired last year, he sold off his collection, and I bought this one. It's authenticated. I've got the provenance paperwork and everything. "Can I see the paperwork?" Eddie asked. Raymond hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, why not?" He went to a back room and returned with a folder. Inside was a handwritten receipt from 1974, signed by a teenage Eddie Van Halen, selling one Teisco Del Rey guitar to Mel's Music for $75. There was also a letter from the music store owner, written in 2000, explaining the guitar's history. Eddie read the documents. They were real. He'd written that receipt himself when he was 19 years old, desperate for cash. "So you can see why I can't sell it," Raymond said. "This guitar is going to be worth serious money. Eddie Van Halen is a legend. Someday this will be a museum piece." "What if Eddie Van Halen wanted to buy it back?" Eddie asked carefully. Raymond laughed. "Eddie Van Halen doesn't know this guitar exists, and even if he did, he probably doesn't remember it. The guy plays custom guitars that cost thousands of dollars. Why would he care about a beat-up old Teisco?" Eddie looked down at the guitar in his hands. Why would he care? Because this guitar represented a version of himself that no longer existed. A kid who didn't know if he'd ever make it, who poured every dollar he had into chasing an impossible dream, who carved his initials into cheap guitars because he believed, despite everything, that those initials would matter someday. "What if I told you," Eddie said slowly, "that I'm Eddie Van Halen, and this is my guitar, and I'd really like to buy it back?" Raymond stared at him for a moment, then laughed again. "Right. And I'm Jimi Hendrix. Look, I appreciate the joke, but I've had a lot of people try to talk me into selling this guitar. You're going to have to do better than pretending to be Eddie Van Halen." Eddie took off his sunglasses and his baseball cap. Raymond's laughter died. He looked at Eddie's face, really looked, and the color slowly drained from his cheeks. "Oh my God," Raymond whispered. "I carved those initials when I was 16, Eddie said quietly. "I modified the bridge myself because I wanted a vibrato system and couldn't afford to buy one. I moved the pickup selector because the original position was uncomfortable for how I played. I sold this guitar in 1974 to Mel's Music for $75 because Van Halen had a gig coming up and I needed money to fix my amp. I've thought about this guitar probably 100 times over the years, wondering where it ended up." Raymond sat down heavily on a nearby stool. "You're really Eddie Van Halen." "I really am." "And this is really your guitar?" "It really is." Raymond looked at the guitar, then at Eddie, then back at the guitar. His dream of owning a valuable piece of rock history was colliding with the reality that the history was standing in front of him, asking for it back. "I paid $8,000 for this guitar," Raymond said quietly. Eddie nodded. "That's fair. I'll give you $10,000. $10,000? Raymond looked up sharply. "It's worth more than that to me," Eddie said. "This guitar is part of my history, part of my story. I can't put a price on what it means, but $10,000 seems fair for your investment, plus some extra for the trouble." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. Eddie could see him thinking, calculating, wrestling with the decision. "Mr. Van Halen," Raymond finally said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why does this guitar matter to you? You've played on stages all over the world. You've got guitars that cost more than my car. You literally have a signature guitar line. Why do you care about this beat-up old Teisco?" Eddie sat down on another stool, still holding the guitar. "You know how you said this guitar was going to be worth serious money someday? You're probably right, but that's not why it matters to me." He gestured to the guitar in his hands. "When I bought this, I was 15 years old. My family had immigrated from Holland. We didn't have much money, and I was this weird Dutch kid who could barely speak English, trying to fit in by learning to play guitar. This instrument was everything to me. I practiced on it until my fingers bled. I modified it because I couldn't afford better equipment. I carved my initials into it because I had this crazy dream that someday Eddie Van Halen would mean something." Eddie ran his hand over the worn finish. "Every scratch on this guitar is from those years. Every modification is a problem I solved with my own hands. This guitar is proof that I existed before I became Eddie Van Halen, the rock star. This is Eddie Van Halen, the kid, the dreamer, the guy who wasn't sure he'd make it, but kept trying anyway." Raymond was listening intently. "I don't need this guitar," Eddie continued. "I have dozens of guitars, but I want it, because sometimes I forget that kid I used to be. I forget what it felt like to not be sure, to be chasing something impossible. This guitar reminds me. It keeps me connected to the guy who started all this." Raymond looked at the guitar in Eddie's hands, then at the paperwork on the counter, then at Eddie's face. "Mr. Van Halen," Raymond said, "I can't sell you this guitar." Eddie's heart sank. "I understand. I know you paid good money." "No, you don't understand," Raymond interrupted. "I can't sell you this guitar because it's yours. It always was yours. I've been holding it for you for a year without knowing it." Raymond stood up and pushed the paperwork across the counter toward Eddie. "Take it. No charge. This guitar should be with you." Eddie shook his head. "I can't do that. You paid $8,000, and I'll make that back on the story," Raymond said with a smile. "Do you know how many times I'm going to tell people about the day Eddie Van Halen walked into my shop and I refused to sell him his own guitar? That's worth way more than $8,000. "At least let me pay you what you invested," Eddie insisted. They negotiated for 20 minutes. Eddie wanted to pay the full $10,000. Raymond refused to take more than $5,000, calling it a finder's fee for reuniting Eddie with his guitar. They eventually settled on $7,000. Eddie wrote a check, and Raymond wrote a receipt. "Can you do me one favor?" Raymond asked as Eddie was preparing to leave. "Name it. Can we take a photo, you, me, and the guitar? I want to remember this." They took several photos, Eddie holding the guitar, Raymond holding the guitar, both of them with the guitar. Eddie even signed the back of one of the photos. To Raymond, "Thanks for keeping my guitar safe. Eddie Van Halen, 2001. As Eddie was walking out with the guitar case, Raymond called after him. "Mr. Van Halen, can I ask you one more thing?" "Sure." "What are you going to do with it? Put it in a display case, museum?" Eddie looked down at the case in his hand. "I'm going to play it. That's what guitars are for. Maybe I'll even write a song on it. This guitar has been silent for 30 years. Time to wake it up." Eddie kept that promise. The Teisco became a regular part of his collection, not as a museum piece, but as a working instrument. He'd pull it out during writing sessions, letting the worn neck and familiar weight inspire new ideas. He played it for Wolfgang, showing his son where it all started. When Eddie Van Halen died in 2020, Raymond Chen posted the photos from that day, along with the story. The post went viral. Thousands of people commented on the beauty of the encounter, a pawnshop owner who recognized the value of returning something precious to its rightful owner, and a rock legend who cared enough about his past to seek out a cheap guitar from his youth. One comment summarized it perfectly. Eddie Van Halen could have bought any guitar in the world, but the one he wanted most was the one that reminded him of who he was before the world knew his name. That's not just humility. That's wisdom. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Have you ever been reunited with something from your past that reminded you of who you used to be? Share your story in the comments.